Guju, Peggy Flanagan, Nidijinakaz, Guabagani, Ganikagda, and Junjaba, Mangan, Dundame. My name's Peggy Flanagan. I'm a citizen of the White Earth Nation, and my family is the Wolf Clan, and I'm really honored to be here with you. You know, I think Tom Rademacher is a pretty amazing guy, and clearly, based on Miss Whitley, is a really powerful teacher who helps young people find their voice. And so I'm honored to also be able to share the stage with them. And super psyched that this was sold out, which is the closest that either of us will probably be to being rock stars. So a sold out show at Ice House, yeah! Woo. So some of you may be like, why is the girl from Glee here talking about education? I was a little bit like Rachel Berry growing up. There's nothing ironic about show choir. It's why I went to school every day, which is what we'll talk about here in a second. But I grew up in St. Louis Park, which, if you don't know, is like God's country. And so grew up in St. Louis Park, and you know, there weren't a whole lot of Native students. I'm sure you're surprised. But you know, my mom moved us to St. Louis Park when I was a baby because she knew that I would have access to good schools, stable neighborhoods, and an opportunity to thrive. And I believe that my community was really influential in my development, but I'll also tell you that I struggled as well. I didn't have a teacher who looked like me until I was a sophomore in college. And you know, growing up, I had those handful of teachers, Peter Redmond, who is a teacher at St. Louis Park High School, who changed my life, who helped me find my voice. He was the only teacher of color at St. Louis Park High School. And he truly saw and heard students. And he continues to be an incredible mentor and active cheerleader in my life to this very day. And that is the power of educators. But I also know a handful of teachers who were fairly destructive in my life as well, and did not handle me with care. And so, you know, during my education journey, and I'm going to tell you all a secret, shh, okay? Keep it here and on the TPT website. But I graduated from high school with a 1.75 GPA. And I did really well. I did really well in speech, in English and creative writing, in math classes where, you know, I had teachers who used different ways to teach instead of just being up at the front of the room and asking you to write down problems right on your paper. But it was the teachers that I built a relationship with and were able to really see who I was as a young Native woman, who were why I survived. And those teachers in particular in the arts, in music, and theater, who got me through. And so I went to St. Cloud State my freshman year. And coming from a community like St. Louis Park, where we kind of all just hung out together, and going to St. Cloud State, where it was very clear at the time that the African-American students hung out, the Asian students hung out, the Native students hung out, the white students hung out, and I was like, where do I go? Because that was not my experience. And there were also folks, I started having pictures of American Indian mascots, like printed off of, you know, off the interwebs, hung on my door. And it was like, what? And it took me a while, right, to get like, oh, that's derogatory, right? And then started putting, there were like a couple of articles about Native students on campus who were holding powwows and community meetings. And someone was cutting those out and putting those also on my door with racist comments about American Indians. And, you know, I went to the administration and I complained a couple of times. And we figured out who it was, but it wasn't until the last time we went to the administration, I said, wow, this is gonna make a really powerful letter to the editor in the St. Cloud Times, that they actually took any action about it. And I didn't really know what threat I was making at that point, right? I just was like, I think this is what you say, right? And so from there, you know, I was in show choir, shocking, and my choir teacher was leaving St. Cloud State, and he said, you can either stay here, or he said, you can either go to the University of Minnesota, or you can come with me to the University of Michigan. This is not a safe school for you, for a whole host of reasons. And I went to the University of Minnesota. And the first class that I walked into was Intro to American Indian Studies with Dr. Brenda Child at the front of the room, who looked just like me. And it changed everything. I was in a classroom surrounded by other American Indian students, being taught by an American Indian educator, and my whole life changed. Suddenly, I was a sponge, and I wanted to know everything. I took honors level coursework for fun, and for the first time was told that I was smart and that I should, you know, start taking graduate level courses as an undergrad by Dr. Brenda Childs. And several folks that I know who are Indigenous or people of color have a similar story, that things didn't sort of fall into place, they didn't fit until they got to college, if they got to college. What an incredible loss of young people who do not feel seen or heard or valued. Now, I had teachers who were not of color, who were incredibly instrumental in my life, but I can't tell you the difference that it made to just have a teacher who knew who I was and knew where I came from, and frankly challenged me to say, like, you are here. You have a responsibility to other Native folks who are not here. And that was just a different way to look at my education. So I graduated with a degree in child psychology and American Indian Studies, and I went on to the Division of Indian Work as my first job out of college. And my job was to help bridge the gap between the community and Minneapolis public schools. Now, like, easy, right? Was like done and done. No, so it was a hard job. I was 23 at the time, and you know, really saw for the first time how families of color and Native families were treated when they walked into school buildings. And I could stand there for a long time before anyone would talk to me, right? And I'm a fairly assertive person, right? But for families who had had a traumatic experience, boarding schools are one generation removed from my family, that, you know, that is trauma within itself. And when folks are not kind, when they are not welcoming, we're telling families what we expect of them, frankly. So it was through that process, Carol Johnson was the superintendent at the time, who was also my superintendent when I went to St. Louis Park High School, who used to give me rides home from school after student council. Shocker, I was on student council. You know, she was like, great. You know, I gave her a call. I didn't know that you don't usually just like call up the superintendent and be like, hey, I got this new job. I need your help, right? But she put me on a couple of committees that I was clearly way in over my head, but realized like that how the district worked, or frankly didn't work. And spent about 6 months, sort of all during this time. I had also worked and volunteered on the Wellstone for Senate campaign in 2002, which also made me go, oh, electoral politics can be a force for good, woo! And so like that's all happening. But really spent, he's like, well, if there's never been an American Indian on the school board before, and we're not having our issues, frankly, really listened to, we gotta do something about that. And spent about 6 months trying to find that person. And like weird, American Indians didn't want to be part of like a government structure. You know, like we've always had like a really positive relationship with the government. Yeah, like just, hey, just sign this. What does it say? It doesn't matter, it's fine. So, you know, so that took a while. And then we had this event at the Indian Center down here on Franklin. And it was a community meeting to talk about education. You know, I was like really excited and fired up. And Clyde Bellecourt, for those of you who, folks know who Clyde Bellecourt is from the American Indian Movement. So he like had just finished giving one of these like, with the blood of Geronimo running through our veins, kind of like big speech, like mic drop. And then folks are like, does anyone else have anything? And like, you never like, yep, you know, and I said, yeah, I sure do. So just wondering if anyone wants to run for the school board. If you do, you should come talk to me. Thank you very much. And then I sat down. And at that point, folks were like, why don't you do it? I was like, what? No, that's not what I meant at all. I don't have any kids. I'm like 24. No, that's probably a bad idea. And then after talking to folks in the community, I was like, what the heck, right? Like, I'm not gonna win, so at least we're gonna talk about the issues that are really important in the community, right? We're gonna talk about poverty, we're gonna talk about the opportunity gap and how, you know, young people don't see themselves reflected in their curriculum. And, you know, surprise, surprise, people actually cared about those things. And I remember a high-ranking elected official at the time said to me, you know, Peggy, you really should stop talking about poor children because you make people uncomfortable and it's hard for folks to connect with you. I was like, wow, well, you know, if folks don't like what I'm talking about, they probably just don't have to vote for me. So, I don't know. And so we ran a really great grassroots campaign and registered voters and went to all the folks, you know, the places where people are like, don't bother, those people don't vote. And I'm like, I am those people, so I should go there. And we're able to do some pretty great things in Minneapolis Public Schools with our memorandum of agreement between the American Indian community and the district. And we're still working on it. We're still moving. But sort of through that experience, and a full host of others. You know, I got to Wellstone Action as a job that I had before CDF and ran the Native American Leadership Program and taught folks across the country how to organize and run for office and work on issues that were of importance to them. And that led me to CDF. And CDF, Children's Defense Fund Minnesota, has this program called Freedom Schools. How many of you have heard of Freedom Schools? Yeah, all right, good. So Freedom Schools is this primarily summer learning and literacy program for students K-8. And the purpose of Freedom Schools, right, is to have young people fall in love with learning. And the way that we do that is by having curriculum that looks like the students in the classroom, books that are written by and for students of color, and by having servant leader interns who are the educators who are in the classroom around young people. It's very powerful. And focused primarily on the African American community. We also have Latino Freedom Schools. And the overwhelming majority of students who go through our program, 87% of our kids who go through Freedom Schools either maintain or accelerate their reading level over the summer. 87%. And so when we talk about like, man, we just don't know how to reach these kids. We totally do know how to reach these kids, right? It's that at times we lack the political will to do what's necessary, to not talk about diversity, but to talk about an anti-racist classroom. It's a different kind of conversation. And that's what Freedom Schools were born out of, right? Sort of out of the civil rights movement, and now in their, you know, the way that they've been created by Mary Wright Edelman 20 years ago was to create alternative spaces where our young people could feel valued, heard, respected, and could fall in love with learning. And so when I was brought onto CDF, part of my job was to create American Indian Freedom Schools. Again, it was like easy. Right? No, not so easy. But I would say that Superintendent Bernadette Johnson, who is here, was incredibly instrumental in helping us to create American Indian Freedom Schools. So we had the first American Indian Freedom Schools, focused freedom schools, this past summer. We had one site that was K-5 at the Division of Indian Work was our partner, and then another site which was 6 through 12 at the American Indian Center, and had a young man named Nation Wright, who was a senior when I was elected to the school board in 2005, who now I have to remember is a grown man with a family. Hired him and brought him on board, and he has started to run this program. We now are at 3 sites after school. So we are at Anderson Open Community School. We are at Sanford Middle School. And Emily Palmer is here, who's the principal. Woo! Yeah, hey. And we're at South High. And so we're running after-school program, and then we'll be moving into, again, our summer Freedom School program. And I tell you that whole thing because I've sort of watched this come full circle in my life. I am now the mom of a 2.5-year-old. Her name is Siobhan. Siobhan Mayengan Hellendrung. So the first day of school is always going to be a little rough on her teachers as she confidently walks into the room and asserts who she is. But I care about this more than I ever did before. When you turn on the television and you see images of American Indians, or you go to a movie, or you turn on the Sunday football and see a particular football team with a particular mascot, the images that we see of American Indians are perverted images. It is not who we are as Indian people. We do not see images of contemporary American Indian people. And that's why programs like Freedom School, where our young people see other leaders, right, from the community who look like them, who care about them, who are doing community building work, are reading books about who they are and where they come from and modern day heroes. That is powerful stuff. It is very powerful stuff. And that is what I want for my child, and frankly for all children, to be able to see folks who look like them, who value them, who are doing good work in the community that they can aspire to be like. And I'll just do a quick aside. I posted Viola Davis, right, won last night an Emmy Award. Woo! And I posted this image of part of her speech, right, is that, she talked about, women of color are just as powerful as actresses, and they just simply lack the opportunity. One of my sort of conservative relatives, I have them, believe it or not, conservative relatives posted under a link to the Wikipedia page of all of the African Americans who have ever won Emmys before. And I was like, I'm not exactly sure what you're trying to tell me with this, but the first African-American woman to win, right, as lead actress, that matters. But it also matters, right, that there are no images. I don't ever turn on the TV and see an American Indian person, ever, right? And my daughter just doesn't have that in her life in popular culture and media. And so that is part of, I think, our role as people who care about children and as educators, is to provide those spaces and that opportunity. And how many of you are teachers? Awesome. So thank you for being here and valuing young people and seeing them and working to create anti-racist space within your school. It is challenging. It makes people uncomfortable. And in Minnesota, man, do we have a hard time talking about race. My husband is from New Ulm. I didn't think I'd marry an Eagle Scout from New Ulm, but it happened. And we'll talk about some tough issues. And, what inevitably happens is someone's like, who wants pie? Right? Which is the response that we have in Minnesota when we talk about tough stuff. And young people will not let you do that. And so, in this space and in your classroom, to create that welcoming community where young people can be heard and tell their truth. It took me 19 years to be able to tell my truth, and I'm still telling my truth, and it's still uncomfortable. But we have answers, right? We have some answers of young people feeling heard and valued, reflected in their curriculum, being intentional. You know, some of you have heard we have a teacher shortage, right? Being intentional about growing new teachers. It doesn't happen on accident that people decide to be educators, right? And we have a responsibility to the folks in our classroom, to the young people in our lives, in particular of color, to say this is a pathway for you. And that's also the additional layer within Freedom Schools that I hope that we are able to move. To have young people who are in the classroom, who are teaching folks who are just coming up underneath them that say, this is a pathway for me. And we know that that has happened with several of our students, but we want to be more intentional about it and hope that you will join Children's Defense Fund in that work. So in my language, I say, chi miigwech, big thanks for the opportunity to be here today.